Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Brazil under pressure as U.S. President Trump defends his ally, Jair Bolsonaro.
The tariffs have no commercial motive. They're political and personal. We can only hope common sense will prevail.
Now, the popular and polarizing former president is placed under house arrest. So what's next? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
I'm Marya Bruno. I am the coordinator for international partnerships at Agência Pública. We are a nonprofit investigative newsroom in Brazil. I am a former producer for Al Jazeera and for NBC News.
Marya, welcome to The Take. It's really good to have you here. Let's start near the sands of Copacabana, that iconic crescent-shaped beach in Rio de Janeiro, where supporters of former far-right President Jair Bolsonaro gathered on Sunday at a rally. Set the scene for us. What was happening, and how did it lead to a judge ordering Bolsonaro to house arrest?
Copacabana is a classic setting for Bolsonaro's supporters' rally. He's been doing this for many, many years. That's the place where they gather to protest or to support Bolsonaro when he was in office and after he lost the election. So the last rally in Copacabana Beach had one of Bolsonaro's sons, a senator, Flávio Bolsonaro, on stage. The problem that took place was that he did a live stream of Bolsonaro, of former President Bolsonaro, while President Bolsonaro was in his house in Brasilia, saluting, cheering to the crowd. How does that lead to his house arrest the next day? Bolsonaro had a measure that prohibited him from accessing social media. Therefore, since he, according to Supreme Court Justice Alexandra Locke, he violated this measure, Justice Moraes decided to put him in house arrest and once again reinforced the decision to bar him from using social media.
Okay, so you mentioned the judge. Now, in his order, Supreme Court Judge Alexandra Locke had some pretty sharp words for the former president. He said Bolsonaro was trying to make a fool out of the Brazilian judiciary, writing that justice is blind but not foolish. He frankly sounds pretty fed up, but that might be because there's a history here. So what should we know about the story between these two?
It's a long feud, Malika, between Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes and former President Jair Bolsonaro. That's because Moraes, he concentrates the reports on the main lawsuits that are related to the attempt coup d'etat that Bolsonaro would allegedly led in 2023, and other episodes that are linked to disinformation and attacks to Brazilian institutions. Bolsonaro has lashed out on Alexandre de Moraes multiple times since he was in office, actually. And his supporters, his political allies, and his sons, who are also lawmakers, they state that Alexandre de Moraes' harsh measures are actually part of a dictatorship status that he's trying to impose in Brazil.
And Moraes is also under sanctions, and not just any sanctions that are usually reserved for people suspected of gross human rights abuses, terrorism. What's behind that?
What's behind it? It's a very successful articulation that his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, lawmaker, currently living in Texas, with Trump supporters and Trumpist lawmakers. At Agência Pública, we revealed last year that they were pushing for sanctions against both Justice Alexandre de Moraes and Brazil. Eduardo by then denied that he was pushing those sanctions. He recorded a video saying that they were not doing this. But we've been following their meetings in the Capitol and human rights committees where they were, again, gathering with Republicans and MAGA supporters looking for a punishment against Justice de Moraes. The final chapter in this was the 50% tariffs that President Trump determined in an executive order in the beginning of July. And last week, they determined that Justice Alexandra de Moraes would be punished with the Magnitsky Law, which basically forbids him to have any economic connections with American institutions.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so I want to get back to the tariffs and Trump's involvement in all of this, but I want to lay the groundwork here for people who may be coming to this story fresh or hadn't thought about Bolsonaro in a little while. He is facing a lot of legal trouble, and that could end up with him in prison. So remind us, what is Bolsonaro accused of doing? How did we get here?
Bolsonaro is accused of planning a coup plot to remain in office in spite of his defeat in the presidential elections in 2022. The Attorney General accuses him of leading a criminal organization that tried to stage this coup and to attempt a violent abolition of the democratic rule of law. The climax of that took place in January 8 in the capital of Brasilia in 2023. That was 1 week after President Lula took office. Events that were very similar to the January 6, 2021 in the capital happened in Brasilia. Bolsonaro supporters, they stormed the Supreme Court headquarters, the presidential palace, and the Congress. But there's also other evidence collected among Bolsonaro supporters and some of his main allies. So one of the general from the Brazilian army, for example, that was helping Bolsonaro, it was found in his house a written plan to assassinate President Lula and his VP.
Wow.
This general testified in the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago, and he said those were digital thoughts only. There was also a rough draft that was found with one of Bolsonaro's main aides, which is called like the coup draft, which again, they denied that it was a coup draft, but it has basically setting the scenario and describing in detail the possibilities that would take place in the case that there was a military intervention. So there is robust evidence that was gathered by the investigation, not only by Bolsonaro, but around many people connected to former President Bolsonaro, that leads them to conclude that Bolsonaro was aware and was also leading this attempt to oust President Lula.
So Bolsonaro has denied the allegations against him, and some Brazilian lawmakers have been trying to pass a bill that would grant him amnesty.
You haven't seen me act against the Constitution at any time. I played by the rules all the time.
Some of his supporters even staged a protest in Congress where they put tape over their eyes and their mouths because they say the judge was trying to censor Bolsonaro. Where does that push for amnesty stand?
The request for an amnesty should be voted for the representatives to pass. So their struggle now, the Bolsonaro supporters in parliament, their main struggle now is to have the House Speaker put that amnesty request to be voted. For now, there is no sign that this is going to happen immediately or in the upcoming days. But given the speed of the events of this political crisis in Brazil, we cannot say that they can maybe do an articulation that can force the House to vote this amnesty. According to Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, living in the U.S., he's also a lawmaker, and he's under a leave now. He said that this is the only way for him to try to start to ask for the lifting of the sanctions against Brazil, along with the U.S. officials in the Trump administration. So he's basically blackmailing the country for either passing the amnesty or harshing the sanctions against Brazil and against Supreme Court members.
So given all of that, what is the mood in the country right now? Of course, it's a very large country and you're not all across all parts, but from what you're seeing of opinion polls and from speaking to people, how are people feeling? How tense is it?
It's funny because in the streets, there's a big sense of normality, and it's similar to other moments when we went through a political crisis. So when in 2016, when former President Dilma Rousseff was impeached, you see like this strange sense of normality in the streets. But the temperature, when measured by the polls, is that most of the Brazilians, they do not support a general amnesty on President Bolsonaro and those that are being prosecuted for the events that took place in January 8th. We're not talking of a vast majority, but the majority that goes after 50% or 60%. On the other hand, the support for President Bolsonaro is undeniable. He has a core group of supporters that is there with him, like regardless of the events. And then you have voters who have supported Lula and then switched to Bolsonaro and switched to Lula again in the latest elections. So I would say that these voters, maybe we can call them like the swing voters, they're the ones who will decide the future of the presidency in the presidential elections in 2026.
Elections that Bolsonaro is not allowed to run in, correct?
Precisely, because of a different lawsuit, Bolsonaro was barred from running to elections until 2030. And that's another claim that his sons and his supporters question. They want Bolsonaro to run next year. And they claim that the very fact that Bolsonaro cannot run makes the elections illegal or unfair or rigged.
More with Marya Marta after the break.
In 2014, Karen Rodriguez was kidnapped by one of Mexico's deadliest cartels. Her mum vowed to hunt them down and bring them to justice. We'll investigate this story and others from across the globe on True Crime Reports.
So, Marya Marta, we can't tell this story without talking about the role of the U.S. and the role the Trump administration is playing. The administration hit Brazil with a 50% tariff on some Brazilian goods that went into effect this week. Now, President Trump directly linked the tariffs to Bolsonaro's trial, which he's called a witch hunt, a judicial witch hunt. So what impact could these tariffs have on Brazil's economy? Is this actually a big deal?
It is a big deal. There's a lot of concern about the impacts, though we cannot feel it immediately because the tariffs just took place yesterday. There's still a lot of concern, and the government is preparing an economic package to help especially small producers who will be mostly affected by those tariffs. So we're talking on fruit producers. We're talking on fishermen. We're talking on coffee exporters. There's a lot of concern. And also, we must say that this subject has sort of captured the political agenda and the economic resources in the country. Because since the announcement of those sanctions, this is the subject that is prevailing. Because this is not affecting only Supreme Court justice members or the Bolsonaro family. This will affect real people. This may cost jobs. And we're still waiting to see the main impact on this. According to the tariffs that by the date have been announced by the Trump administration, Brazil would look like if it was the worst enemy for the United States, because Brazil has the highest tariffs among all countries in the world. And this is a scenario that simply doesn't mirror the 200 years of international relations between both countries.
Wow. So you mentioned the potential harm that could come to everyday Brazilians. The irony here is that it was Bolsonaro's son who lobbied for these tariffs and the sanctions on the judge we mentioned earlier, Judge Guimarães. And while Bolsonaro does still have a lot of support, we've seen it on the streets, there were also rallies last week in support of the trial and against President Trump. So though he was once called the tropical Trump, it's not clear that the Trump playbook, which saw Trump return to office in the United States, is actually working in Brazil. Why is that?
Yes, there is a backlash. We must say that, again, according to the polls, we cannot say that Brazilians are supporting these measures and the tariffs. And actually, there's been an increase on the popularity and on the approval rates of President Lula. It's a timid increase, according to some pollsters, something that varies between 3 or 5%. But it's also something that was not happening before this political crisis sparked. So in a sense, many political analysts are saying that this might be an opportunity for the Lula administration to regain its approval rates and its popularities, because many people are seeing this as a very personal agenda from the Bolsonaro family. And it's something that is harming the country in the cost of the economy and the cost of jobs, and only to favor a specific political group.
Wow. Finally, Maria Marta, what would a Bolsonaro conviction mean for the country's democracy and the rule of law and its people?
Again, unpredictable. We must remember, the audience, that President Lula was also arrested. He was arrested in 2018 because of a lawsuit related to corruption. He was arrested for over a year. That spiked a movement across the country to free him. Again, that was the core group of supporters of President Lula. We may see something similar with President Bolsonaro. They mirror themselves in certain ways. If former President Bolsonaro is convicted, he may face up to 30 years in jail, which would obviously not happen. Former President Bolsonaro has 70 years old. So if he faces the harshest sentence. He will likely be a few years in jail, but his attorneys may ask for a lighter sentence. There is an overall understanding in Brazil that conviction, it's basically unavoidable. It's something that will take place. And that all the struggle for amnesty, the sanctions, and all the narrative that Brazil would be under a dictatorship from the Supreme Court is actually a strategy from Bolsonaro's defense to loosen his conviction. Because when it comes to the lawsuit on the coup, on the allegedly trying to stage a coup, the common understanding is that before the end of 2025, the Supreme Court will rule that former President Bolsonaro is convicted. So that what we're all seeing, the whole crisis now, it's basically part as a strategy to make this punishment lighter.
Well, Marya, Marta, thank you for breaking this all down for us and following all of those threads and where they lead. It's complicated, but you helped make it easy. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Malika, for the invitation.
And that's The Take. If you're short on time but still want to catch the highlights, check out our YouTube Shorts. We post quick clips with the best moments from our episodes that you don't want to miss. It's also a great way to stay connected. Let us know what you think, and I'll see you tomorrow.